Hi, everyone. Good morning for most of us, I think. But if you're watching from other parts of the world, it could be good afternoon or even good evening. So I hope you're having a good Saturday. I am going to be talking today about the different types of narcissism, which I think is actually a worthy conversation. I think sometimes I say something once, I'm like, oh, well, some people might be new to this. And I have to say, a lot of people have found this conversation worthwhile because it sheds light on something, or like, oh, I didn't even know that this is how it could show up. So I'm hoping it might clarify some stuff. And also, what it's almost like I want you to view that each thing I'm talking about is like each of these types. They're not separate and distinct. They can mix together. And when you think of it as two ingredients you can mix together, that might even shed more light on your story. So there's that piece of it. Then we're going to do that. And like I said, we're now trying to, keeping the pipe dream alive. And like I said, my sort of commitment to this community was, as long as you keep you're engaging in these conversations, buying books, telling people about the book, all of that. Each week we stay alive on that stupid list. I mean, I will have to say, like, when this is all said and done, I think I'm probably more mad at this list than not, but it's created more conversation about this. We're going to keep these raffles and things going. So until midnight tonight, if you buy a hard copy of the book or an ebook and you verify by the end of the day, it's very easy to do. It's just name and email. You do that. The link to verify your purchase is in the bio on Instagram and in the video notes for YouTube. Each purchase counts separately. So if you want to think of the book as a raffle ticket, if you're buying some for gifts or work or to give away to other people, then great, you can do that. So I got my handy dandy copy. I kind of carry it around with me like a sort of like a, I don't even know what, like a little support device. And so if you do that, then you will be entered yet again into the raffle. Like I said, we make that promise that there will be a raffle. So the names this week will also get drawn. If by some miracle it happens again next Wednesday, then we'll keep going. So with all the giveaways and the frequent lives. But think of the good news. I won't be bothering you with these lives as much if that doesn't happen. And we'll sort of, like I said, not the conversations won't stop. We'll just be having them in a different way. The good thing is it's 30% off on Amazon. So it's only like $20 if you get it that way, which is a big price reduction. So that's also something else. If you're like, oh, do I want it? Do I not? You can get it there. Sometimes you can find ebook promotions that are really cheap. And so that could work. So whatever works for you to get it. If you're one of the people who haven't, please do. And like I said, if you want another entry into that raffle, get another book. Again, until midnight tonight in whatever time zone you're on. It's based on your time zone. Midnight in your time zone, not mine. I'm not even in my usual time zone. So midnight in your time zone, buy it, register it on our pre-order verification, get into that raffle. And also, everyone wins something. And what is that? If you've already done it, you've gotten it, which is ticket to our live virtual retreat, which is a $600 value. After all of this is done, after all this hoopla dies down, it'll be available for purchase. But if you get this, you verify your purchase, you can attend that virtual retreat, a live virtual retreat on healing from narcissistic abuse with exercises, conversations, speakers, the whole 9 yards. So keep that in mind too, that you will actually get access. Some of you said, oh, I'm getting to this party late. That's okay. That is still available to you. So know that all those things are still there for you to get. And so do it. Again, we're doing 5 more teas with Dr. Ramani for each week. We continue to create, that we're getting this many people purchasing it. We're just going to make that possible. So those are all the things that I'm going to announce first. That's the whole spiel. So now let me go into what I really want to talk about. Please keep in mind, I'm going to be answering questions. So go ahead and drop those in at any point. But, and your questions will probably come up quite a bit more as I start talking about this topic. So the types of narcissism, okay? These types are so important to know. In fact, for years, not talking about the types is what made this so complicated a conversation, right? So let's start with basics. We know narcissism is on a continuum from mild to severe. At the mild end, and I'm guessing people who tune in and really are trying to learn about healing, it's not as much as what you're probably dealing with in a primary relationship. It's emotional immaturity. It is selfishness. It's the person who is very, very, almost very social media, very want to put their life on display. Again, it's immature. It's a person who at 50 is still doing the kinds of stuff an 18-year-old would be doing with the same zeal and absolutely no sense of self-consciousness. If you have a friend like this, probably the biggest annoyance is that you might have to listen to them yammer on when they have a problem, but when you have something real going on in your life, they're nowhere to be found. They're just not interested in having that role. It's a tough kind of parent to have because they really are sort of vapid and immature. It's a tough partner to have because you're trying to raise kids with someone like this. This is the co-parent who might actually not always help with the kids because they want to play their video games with their friends kind of thing. It's an immaturity. That's the mild end. Obviously, the severe end is when we're talking about one of the types we'll be talking about is malignant narcissism, real harm, coercive, exploitative, can be dangerous, isolating, very manipulative. Obviously the mild versus the severe, those people feel like they're in very different experiences. And the moderate, which is actually really what it's not you really focuses a lot on all of that stuff in the middle. It's problematic. It's psychologically unhealthy to be in a relationship with someone in the moderate side. It may not be terrifying, and it's certainly not just annoying like we'd see on the milder end. So let's talk about these types, and let's start at the top, which is grandiose narcissism. Grandiose narcissism is sort of the classical kind of conception of narcissism. It's sort of the apple pie of pies. It's kind of our baseline assumption of what this is. And that there's interesting problems that come up with that. So grandiose narcissism, this is the narcissistic person who is arrogant, self-centered, pretentious, attention-seeking, charming, charismatic, very often quite successful. Everything's about them, but they can also be quite extroverted. If things are going their way, they can actually seem super fun, very interesting, very engaging. Interestingly, that when it's going well with a grandiose narcissist, people will say, this was actually the most fun relationship I was ever in. It was great. It was fun. I felt seen. I felt fairy tale-ish. When it gets dark with a grandiose narcissist, you're much more likely to blame yourself because when it was good, it was really, really good. Those of you with grandiose narcissistic parents might have really remembered a very sparkly parent who was sort of the center of attention. For times, you might even have felt proud that this was your parent because everyone was like, sort of like, whoa, what a cool person. And they might have they might have had a large network of friends and things around them. In the workplace, a grandiose narcissistic boss can be a very charismatic leader. Again, classical conception, and interestingly, grandiose narcissistic folks of all the types of narcissism probably by far function the best in the world. It's not to say they're not harmful in relationships, because when things don't go well for a grandiose narcissist, they can get really dark really fast. And other people may not see that. The grandiose narcissist will be better at sort of keeping on that good mask in public kind of thing, and then in private get really angry, blame other people when things aren't as shiny for them. But that's the grandiose narcissist. It's the grown adult who still thinks of themselves as like a kid playing superheroes. Like they really think that they're all that. They think of themselves as generous and empathic. Like they have a very distorted view of themselves because it's not all true. That's the grandiose narcissist. Now, the next type of narcissist I'm going to talk about is the vulnerable narcissist. The vulnerable narcissist is sometimes called the covert narcissist. I prefer using the term covert narcissist to describe the narcissistic person who is really good at putting two faces to the world. That very shiny public face, and then that really cruel behind closed doors face. But sometimes people use the word covert to describe what I'm about to call the vulnerable narcissist, which is the form of narcissism. Now remember, all narcissism has as its core, it doesn't matter the type, all narcissism has as its core entitlement, the variable or low empathy, the grandiosity, the arrogance, the excessive need for admiration and validation, the selfishness. Those things are all part of every narcissistic person. It shows up differently depending on the type. So the vulnerable narcissistic person has all those same things, but they come out very differently. The narcissistic person is sullen, resentful, angry, passive-aggressive, chronically victimized. They blame the world for anything going wrong with them. They feel other people are out to get them. Where the grandiose narcissistic people are quite often very successful. They really are. They often are because they're great salespeople. The vulnerable narcissistic people talk big dreams, but almost never launch them. So they're brooding in these dreams that never took off. For the grandiose folks, their dreams often take off. The problem is they can often be quite unethical and do shady stuff. So the stuff that takes off can go south, go south, go to hell, but then they still manage to salvage it and do it again. The vulnerable narcissist often doesn't get things going because they sort of feel everyone's against them. That's a big thing for the vulnerable narcissistic person. But again, there can even be a social anxiety about vulnerable narcissistic folks. So they don't look charming and charismatic. And this is why this form of narcissism is called covert narcissism by some folks, because it does not. When you first meet a vulnerable narcissist, they do not seem charming and charismatic and confident. In some ways, they kind of feel a little socially awkward, a little socially uncomfortable. You might even feel like, okay, I'm definitely not dealing with a narcissistic person because this person is just so socially kind of off. They're not feeling comfortable. So, okay, dodged that bullet. Now I can keep talking to them. But then you keep talking to them, and what you might see is they might start selling you this really sort of down on their luck story. And then if you have empathy, you might feel bad for them and you might want to help them. Oh, how can I help? I know someone who can help you. And you might, especially if you're a natural rescuer, you could really jump in there, try to make things better for them. The vulnerable narcissistic person really pulls for empathy, for sympathy, for pity, even for guilt. And that can retain the whole time you're in the relationship with them. Now, here's what you got to remember. Grandiose and vulnerable narcissism, it's not always fair to sort of pull them apart. A grandiose narcissist, think of it as sort of the top, like a big top of something, a big round object. The top is grandiose. But if things go wrong for the grandiose narcissist, their businesses keep failing, people get aggravated with them in relationships, their friends don't want to talk to them, whatever it is, they have a public shaming or something like that. Vulnerable qualities are going to start to appear: the sullenness, the resentfulness, the anger, the bitterness, the feeling aggrieved, the complaining, the how come nothing ever goes my way, with taking no responsibility. Those traits can start coming up. And then, but the grandiose narcissist is typically grandiose. The vulnerable stuff comes if stuff in their life doesn't go well. You might be wondering, well, what if things went well for a vulnerable narcissist, right? What if they're going through their victimized, shamey, blamey, socially anxious, why is everyone out to get me lives? And then something goes well for them. They will almost not even be gracious about it. They'll say, it's about time. I should have gotten this much earlier. Like, it's about time people finally saw what I am. And there, again, there's this ongoing grumpy, icky, heavy feel. I would argue probably the vast majority of internet trolls are vulnerable narcissists. People who in a place of anonymity are able to sling hurtful comments and insults at people that for whatever reason are getting, they feel uncomfortable with. And so they attack in that way. So that would be a great example of where we see vulnerable narcissists almost in a ubiquitous way, but it's a real failure to launch. That's what you see. It's a big difference between grandiose and vulnerable narcissist. The next form of narcissistic person I'm going to talk about is the malignant narcissist. Now, this is where we're talking about the more severe narcissism, right? To understand the malignant narcissist, it can help to understand something called the dark tetrad. And the dark tetrad is sort of where psychopathy, Machiavellianism, which just means someone who's willing to take advantage of other people, sadism, and narcissism all kind of come together. So these are people who are often more cold, calculating, coercive, willing to use other people to get what they want. They're menacing, they're scary. We talk about coercive control. Those usually are malignant narcissistic people. This is really, really dark. This is where there is almost no empathy. These are people who are malignant narcissistic people are not psychopathic, though. They look like psychopaths. They can feel psychopathic, but psychopathic people are sort of wired a little differently. They really, truly don't feel remorse. Interestingly, a malignant narcissistic person knows when they've done a bad thing, and they're more angry at getting caught. They don't really feel that bad, but they do feel some sense of shame at getting sort of caught out in it. Whereas a psychopathic person is absolutely cold and doesn't have any reaction to that. Right. And so that's sort of where malignant narcissism sits. And it can feel, again, people who are in relationships and malignant narcissists, it's really splitting hairs to see the difference between that and psychopathy. Here you might see more actual violence and aggression. You definitely could see much more financial abuse. If this was a parent you grew up with, you might have witnessed domestic violence between that malignant narcissistic parent and the other parent or other people in the home. There can be, if ever there was a group where there's the greatest likelihood of criminality, it would be the malignant narcissistic folks. So that's malignant narcissism. I'm going to talk about how these all mix in a minute. Then there's communal narcissism. This is such an interesting construct. It's been around for about 20 years. And it was basically this understanding that some people, they get their admiration and validation, their excessive admiration and validation needs met by being viewed as humanitarian, as being helpful, as being sort of saviors, if you will. And so they do things that are very, if you will, pro-social, that help people. They donate lots of money. They volunteer. They give their time. You're thinking, okay, where's the narcissism in this? They're not doing it out of a genuine drive and caring for the people they're helping. They're doing it as part of this, again, this larger sphere of getting attention and admiration. And they'll get quite angry if they don't get admired for their do-gooding. So they're not just doing it because it feels like the right thing to do or it's aligned with their values. They're really doing it as part of a larger spectrum of, look how wonderful and great I am. Now, in a smaller scale, you might have encountered this in the person who, for example, volunteers in the town. They're in the town, small town government, and they volunteer for the church, or they volunteer for the Little League, and they gave money for the Little League field, and their name is all over the town, but they're really terrible to people close to them. They're terrible to their spouse or partner. They're terrible to their children. They might be terrible to people who work for them. So they're not nice people, but the world might have a conception of them as these saviors. Now, at the extreme end, communal narcissists can be almost cult leaders, or they could be these sort of new age guru abusive types who, sort of act like they're saving the world with whatever sort of mindfulness hack of the month, but they're actually might be engaging in really abusive behavior towards the people who, sort of quote unquote follow them. So that's the communal narcissistic person. And it's a tricky type, because some people have said to me, they're like, I grew up with this parent and everyone said they're like a pillar of the community and how lucky you are and you're a model family. And they recall a parent who was cold and awful. And if you didn't make that parent look good publicly, there would be hell to pay. And it's very similar for people who are in relationships with people like this, who will say, like, look how great I am. Look, tell me how great I am. Look at all this great stuff I do. And people get confused by it because they'll say they do a lot of stuff. Like they raise this money and we go to these events and they clean the beach, and but they're so mean at the same time if we're not all sort of giving them a parade for everything they do. And basically the communal narcissistic person expects everyone to get in line with what they're doing and will shame and gaslight people, saying, oh, I guess you're so selfish that you don't care about people who don't have as much as you. And you're thinking, I got a job, fool. Like, I got stuff to do. So that's the communal narcissistic. Now, again, all of these subtypes, grandiose, vulnerable, malignant, and communal, they also exist on a continuum, right? So what you'd say, well, what the hell is a mild malignant narcissist? A mild malignant narcissist is sort of a workplace bully, but whose bark is a little worse than their bite, but they are willing to be, like, they're the people who are always threatening lawsuits, that kind of thing. That might be where you see it, was a severe malignant narcissist is just downright dangerous and probably, engaging in significantly violent behavior. Severe communal narcissist, like I said, would probably be someone who runs a cult. The next type of narcissism is what we call self-righteous narcissism. Back in the day, we had a funny word for this called an anancastic style. That's, if I was teaching a class, that would have been the extra credit question. So, but the self-righteous narcissism is a narcissism where it is manifested by a person who is very, very judgmental, morally rigid, cold, withholding. They are very imperious. They very miserly. So they're often very much like workaholics, but in the worst way, not even out of the love of the game, but they're workaholics and they judge other people for having a life. They judge other people. You don't work as hard as me, so why should I help you out, kind of thing. They could have plenty of money and be able to spot someone $500 to get a doctor's appointment, but they won't, or they'll charge them extortionate interest rates. If you go out to dinner with them, they will be obsessive about saying, well, you did eat more of those chips and the chips and salsa, so you might want to pay a little bit more money. It's that if you show up, let's say you got stuck in traffic, you had a sick kid, and you might have to be half hour late to the dinner, they might tell you, well, don't bother showing up because we will have eaten by then. It's rigid, and there's absolutely no margin for kindness, for flexibility, for warmth. It's a very, very cold way to be. Now, if you grew up with a parent with this, and I can imagine some of you are nodding your heads and said, I didn't know this was a form of narcissism. Think about it. There's absolutely no empathy. There's more empathy for the rules for them than anything else. So these are families where there was a tremendous rigidity. It was a parent's way or no way. Children who went out of line were completely judged. And you watch the parent, they would withhold and withdraw. In essence, psychologically abandon the child when that child didn't do everything to the letter of the law. There would be extreme demands around cleanliness and organization and routine and rigid orders and rules. Some of these homes are very, very steeped in a very severe punitive religiosity. You will sometimes see that too. If you're in an adult relationship with someone like this, here's where it gets to be an interesting kind of a quirk. I've worked with more than a few people clinically who got into these relationships, and they said, when I met this person, they seemed really financially responsible. They almost felt more adulty than the people I was in relationships with. And they said they were very careful and they would budget and we wouldn't go out to fancy dinners. And I thought, well, that's very responsible. And maybe someday we'll buy a house together. But that kind of what felt like fiscal responsibility would become the fancy word for this is impecuniousness. It's sort of, they're cheap MFs is what they are. And every little thing, in fact, I many, many years ago, and I was sort of in my kind of postdoctoral period when we're getting our clinical hours to sit for our licensure exam, I remember someone saying there was a gift fund in her relationship. And I think that the husband said, only a certain amount of money, I don't know, it was like $750 or something like that each year could be spent on gifts. So if one of her gifts went over that amount, it would be taken out of next year's gift total. So she's inside of 5 years, I was in a deficit. And so it was the strangest thing. So she said, it's not even that I wanted something fancy, but he kept these impeccable records. What was fascinating was I heard from the woman years after that, I no longer was working with her, but she decided to get divorced. And she said, financially, it was the most abusive divorce you could imagine. He was coming up with all these receipts he kept over 30 years of gifts he had bought her for $5. And he was trying to assert he should get all that money back. So they can be incredibly financially abusive during a divorce. Every little, forks are being accounted for. It's messy. And if this is in a family setting, you will see that there will often be very little willingness for the self-righteous narcissistic person to help. Again, a lot of that rigidity and judgmentalness. And the final form of narcissism is something we can call more of a neglectful narcissism. It's a narcissism where sort of the breadcrumbing starts right from the jump. And you might be like, why would anyone be attracted to this? It's an interesting kind of a piece of narcissism in the sense of these are sometimes people who get into relationships because they have to. One of the best examples I can give you is people who are culturally mandated to get married. They have arranged marriages, or in their culture, you have to get married, it's a family requirement, but they have no interest. And they literally will not notice the other person in the room unless they're of some service to them. You might be in a workplace relationship like this. And if you had a parent like this, I personally consider that level of emotional neglect to definitely be a form of emotional abuse. They're just not present, and they really do view other human beings as sort of in service to them. They'll only notice them if they need something. They'll look up, and if there's a server in a restaurant, right? We're not getting in a conversation. Sometimes we do, but we may look up and say, hey, can you get me a glass of water? But they're like that with everyone, including people they should be close to. Those are the types. Now, obviously, I could say a lot more about them, but now you can see how they can mix up. Imagine you're in a relationship with a vulnerable, malignant narcissist. Now, I've known people who've been, and they're seethingly sullen, aggrieved, angry, but also hostile, thin-skinned, reactive people. You can already start to see how that combination could result in an incredibly dangerous, provocable person. And it is. To me, the vulnerable meets malignant is the most dangerous combination of all. Because that brooding resentment of the vulnerable narcissist meets that reactive, coercive, menacing, malignant narcissist, and it's almost like a bomb. The grandiose communal narcissist is sort of that person who's a look at me, look how great I am, I'm saving everything, I'm saving everyone. But they really can be quite gossipy and cruel, but they're very flashy in how they do that. And more than a few people we look to in our world as being these grand humanitarian saviors are that combination of grandiose and communal. But when you look at the people in your life, the primary narcissistic relationships in your life, I hope you've been taking a few notes, because it can help to almost close your eyes and think, oh, okay, now this is making sense. Why maybe I'm having a very different, you might say I have 3 narcissistic people in my life. One's a parent, one's a partner, and one's a friend. And you'll say, but it feels different. And it may feel different because they're different types. With grandiose narcissistic folks, it can be the frustration of sort of the way they show up in public and the way they show up with us, but sometimes it can be a somewhat more fun ride. And when they're doing well, it's sort of, you might have like a good run of it. A vulnerable narcissistic relationship can be so much more exhausting because you're constantly feeling like you have to reassure them and it's all going to be okay. And you're often having to pick up the slack because, of course, they failed to launch. And heaven forbid you give them feedback about how to maybe find a job or this or that. And then they're going to lose it on you like, I'm too skilled to do that. How could you imagine you'd suggest to me to do something like that? So it's different eggshells every time. I think the vulnerable narcissists probably pull for the most eggshells because they're so reactively sensitive. But I think that the malignant narcissists pull for the eggshells of fear. So you see how differently that can all mix up. And I think because of that heterogeneity, how different everything in narcissism is, it can sometimes mean that talking about narcissistic abuse or what happens in these relationships gets a little bit murky. Because if I'm dealing with someone in a severe, vulnerable, malignant, narcissistic relationship, I'm dealing with someone who probably looks like they have complex post-traumatic stress. If I'm dealing with somebody who's with a mild, grandiose, communal narcissist, I'm working with someone who's very annoyed and frustrated. Those are very different experiences. And it can sometimes be when you're in the same room as other people, even in the chat, talking amongst yourselves, you might say, this might explain why we are having different experiences. All of these experiences are difficult. They just may be difficult in different ways. And obviously, a parent who's a malignant narcissist is going to affect us differently than maybe perhaps a boss who's a malignant narcissist, where as an adult, we might have more rights or ability to step away from something. But it's a terrifying experience to have a malignant narcissistic parent. So that's just sort of a little sampler platter of what these subtypes of narcissism are. I'd love to open up for questions. So anybody, any questions on that? Okay, here we go. Can a narcissistic person be a mixture of all types depending on what's going on in their life? I would say that, could they be a mixture of all types? Vulnerable, malignant, grandiose, and vulnerable for sure. The one that's jumping out that's probably harder to squeeze in there is that self-righteous type. That self-righteous type I can say, like, for example, you might have communal narcissistic folks that'll say, oh, I can't believe that you wouldn't donate more to a charity. What are you so selfish about spending money on yourself? But they themselves are not living so much in that self-righteous space. I do think self-righteous narcissism is in its sort of like its own little planet with its own little moons. I do see how all of the other ones conceivably could overlap in a pretty significant way, because you could have a grandiose, when they're down on their luck, vulnerable, mixed with malignant and communal. That could actually be a massive cult leader, because the grandiose narcissistic part is what draws people into the cult. The malignant narcissistic part is what would foster the abuses within that cult. The vulnerable narcissistic part will be that sullenness and that victimhood if at all the wagons are circling to get them caught. And the I think that could all come together. I could see sprinklings of self-righteous in there when they're trying to sort of share whatever woo-woo culty message that they're trying to send, or you're going to save the world kind of stuff. That might be, so I think we'd see it there. I like your question though. It's like, depending on what's happening in their life, that's where that grandiose vulnerable alternation happens, right? So you'll see the grandiose, then things aren't going their way. Victim, witch hunt, everyone's out to get me. Woe is me. And then if things come up, they're like one of those wobbly dolls that pops back up. And then the grandiose piece. But if they feel like people have done them wrong, so they're a vulnerable narcissist, they feel people have really done them wrong, there could be some malignant stuff that comes in, like, you are going to pay for this for the rest of your life. And I've known people who've said, I knew my partner was narcissistic. I saw the grandiosity. I even saw the vulnerability. But when the rubber met the road and we were going through the divorce process and they became super vindictive, I was seeing this very, very malignant piece of them. So I think it's a fantastic question, that a lot of this can be shaped by sort of what's happening to the narcissistic person. So while there's often a primary subtype, and then there's sort of usually a secondary type, it's almost like astrology, right? You have your sign and you have this other moon or something, but you can see those sprinklings that will show up. Because remember, the core is all the same for these: the entitlement, the arrogance, the selfishness, the excessive need for admiration and validation. The motivations are the same. All 6 of these types of narcissism are all motivated by power, control, and domination. So I'd say the self-righteous narcissist is more motivated by control. The malignant narcissist probably a little bit more by power and domination. So but I think the grandiose narcissist almost exclusively by power, right? So you're going to see a little bit of a variant even in which motivation is focused on, but I completely agree with you that this could be driven by what else is happening in their lives and also the age and stage of life that they're at. Any other questions? Should I work to turn my empathy on and off? Mine is off automatic and tends to get me involved in the wrong people. So let's separate. It's a great question. Empathy, right? Empathy is, we want it to be the answer. We think it's a great thing, but it is, what we want is empathy that meets discernment. Have both of those things. And I think one of the challenges is if we're being discerning, we think we're being unempathic, right? So if somebody has behaved in ways that are invalidating, that are controlling, that are mean, that are cruel, you've got your information. Now, in the same breath, you hear something about them that's sort of sad, difficult backstory. Things aren't going well for them. They've been abandoned by someone. That's going to pull that empathic part. I kind of feel bad for them. I hate to say that you still got to hold, but they did these bad things. In a strange way, that's what we've got to pay attention to, right? Because if you were to view it as maybe, I don't know, you're hiking on a mountain, okay? And there's different trails. And some of these trails have been affected by the winter storms. So some of them are dangerous. They're dangerous. You go, there's a very good likelihood the trail's been washed away. You're going to get pulled down the side of a cliff and die. It happens, right? And then there's the smarter cliffs to take. And so when you view it as like getting on that dangerous cliff is in essence ignoring this dangerous thing. Like, well, that's the quickest way. I'm going to do that. There's that dangerous path. I'm going to take that. That's what ignoring this is. It's really putting yourself in peril. And you can have that empathy, but empathy does not have to translate into fixing, rescuing, especially when when you've seen what someone's capable of. And I know this flies in the face of everyone deserves a second chance and everyone deserves a chance and chance. Unfortunately, in my life and the way I've watched this go down with so many people, I don't know. I mean, do they? Like, you wouldn't do that with an investment, and yet you'd be willing to make that call in a life, especially when you don't have that much evidence. I'd say to you, if you want to give someone a second chance, let the evidence accumulate. Like let them show you over many, many months or years of sustained change. Now, a narcissistic person will say, well, that's BS. I've shown you this one time I've gotten it right. One time's not enough. And so you were looking for a pattern. So that idea of my empathy has gets me into trouble. How do I turn it off? I'm not convinced you can turn off empathy. I think it's a very automatic, it's wired into our brain. So these are very automatic responses in our brain we feel them physiologically. When we feel empathy for someone, we actually feel physiological changes in us. We feel drawn to help, and it can often feel quite uncomfortable to walk away from someone we think may need our help. But we also have a rational mind, and that rational mind can also allow us. This is why slowing down is so important. It's a big part of discernment. Slowing down and saying, this has been bad many, many times. So either I'm going into this knowing this person's going to do a bad thing again, so I better keep the exit close to me, or I go in very tentatively. or you find a way to help that doesn't put you in harm's way. But I do think that empathy has to meet discernment, and discernment for an empathic person can mean that we're uncomfortable. But if you really, really were to honor, this is this person's track record. I mean, honestly, I would say to you, I'd imagine if you're asking a question, you've probably been through one of these relationships, and your empathy has kind of put you in harm's way in the past. If you were to go back and visit that story, that narrative, there was a point at which you knew this person's behavior was unacceptable, and you still went back in to maybe sort of grapple a little. I mean, we can't undo what's happened, but to grapple a little with how different your life would have been and how it would have felt that when it became pretty clear that that bad behavior was in the house, and you disengage and you didn't feel the need to get in there and help and fix. How would that have been different in your life? How would that have felt at the time? Some people say I would have saved a lot of time if I had done that. But that belief we have in people we care about, that they can change and that they can be better, it's a natural belief, but it's a dangerous and tricky one. And that's why slowing down, sometimes even whatever the equivalent is of sketching it out, becomes so important. It's not about turning your empathy off. It's about bringing discernment in. And sometimes those two feel like they're at odds with each other, but your empathy means you recognize, like, this is tough. I care about this person. They've really been through something, but the discernment means, and this isn't mine to fix. You have another question. Let me just put my do not disturb back on. Here we go. Isn't it normal to enjoy recognition for doing good things? Or is the difference that people get really upset when they don't get the recognition they think they deserve? Oh, absolutely, it's normal. This is why this communal narcissism subtype is tricky. It's absolutely normal to enjoy recognition for doing good things. In fact, we do good things, not necessarily to get the recognition, but if someone says, you get the volunteers award, or you all the work help you did was great, or you're such a wonderful teacher, and we drink that in, that's healthy self-esteem. The communal narcissistic piece is that the motivator for doing the thing, number one, is only to get recognition. It's actually not an empathic attunement to the group being helped. It's this sense of, I want to be recognized as a savior, and they choose something that's going to get them recognized as a savior. Maybe it's available to them, whatever it is. Okay. That's number one. Number two is exactly the thing you brought up, that if we're indeed doing something because it's congruent with our values and we want to be helpful and we do it and it succeeds, we've helped the people or the cause or whatever we've laid out to help, and we are not getting, and usually by communal narcissism, we mean they need a lot of validation, right? They need some sort of gala and a trophy or a prize or people praising them every time. Oh my gosh, you're amazing. Oh my God, you're amazing. And if people aren't saying you're amazing to them every time, they will really be on their back foot. It gets exhausting for the people who are like, oh my gosh, this is almost not worth it for how much we have to tell this person they're amazing. Number two. And number three, that communal narcissistic person will continue to engage in their relationships, like I'll call them regular relationships, whether that's with the partner, with their children, perhaps with family members, perhaps with people who work for them. They'll still be all the narcissistic stuff, the low empathy, the entitlement, the control, the manipulation. So they will not be nice to other people. They will come off as nice because it seems like they're doing a good thing. Oh my gosh, they gave a $1 million donation. What a nice person. I'm like, they gave $1 million donation. That was helpful for this organization. I don't know that they're a nice person. I'd have to spend some time with them. But we make this automatic assumption. So I hope that gives some more clarity on what this thing is. But that the conduct of this communal narcissistic person is the usual narcissistic stuff in mere relationships. It's just that the driver for how they get their admiration and validation is to be this so-called do-gooder. So I hope that clarifies that. Any other questions? Can a malignant narcissist show empathy towards animals, or is that fake? That's a really, really good question. The animals question always comes up, right? We will actually see narcissistic people be really, really devoted, seemingly devoted to a pet. I guess the thing you'd want to watch out with a pet is the same thing you'd want to watch out with a child. Number one, pets are so devoted, right? They are, we can do no wrong in their eyes, and they just sit by our side no matter how we might have yelled at them or something, and they just sort of, so narcissistic people actually really do love animals in a way, because animals are constantly coming back and giving them the validation they need. So that narcissism animal thing we do sometimes see. Now, if the animal is being inconvenient or a problem, you'd have to watch how they interact with that, because I'm struck by sometimes how narcissistic people can be somewhat dismissive of pets, but it's mixed. Sometimes they're actually quite loving towards a pet. Empathy towards an animal is different than empathy towards a human being, though. It's not the same thing. I think people who are empathic to people are empathic to animals. Not everyone who's empathic to animals is empathic to humans, because what the demand of an animal is very different than the demand of a human being, right? They can't talk back. They can't insult you. Your dog is not going to walk up to you and say, you know what, you look fat in that dress. Like, it's not going to happen. So we're not going to have the same interactions with an animal. And because of that, I think we can actually see a more richer repertoire of empathy of the narcissistic person towards an animal than a human. But empathy towards an animal is not the same as empathy towards a human, and that's why it doesn't translate. Is it fake? I think that many narcissistic people do love their pets, and in fact, some people will get confused. They'll say they're so good to their dog, they're so good to their horse, they're so sweet with their cats or whatever their pet is. I don't get it. I'm like, this is why you need to get it, is that they actually are probably so sweet to those things because they're making really no demands on them other than to feed them and water them and walk them. And then the animal will be devoted and will never criticize them and will never abandon them. So it's everything that a narcissistic person would want in a relationship. Any other questions? How do I manage negative self-talk like I'm too sensitive? For me, at least, it increases self-gaslighting and minimization of the abuse so much. So this is because think about when you're saying I'm too sensitive, there's something somewhat protective about that, right? Because when we say that, a couple of things happen. Okay. If you're still in the narcissistic relationship, it allows the relationship to persist and continue. So when we gaslight ourselves, we're kind of doing their dirty work for them because we've been indoctrinated into it. But what also happens is then we are almost creating the reason why we stay. Oh, I'm too sensitive. I'm a handful. So I'm actually kind of lucky that this person is staying with me, right? So it allows the attachment to persist, which, while we're still ambivalent about the relationship, is a really, really tricky space to be in because we don't know what to do. We might feel, from a trauma bonded perspective, it feels too overwhelming to leave the relationship. So to say that I'm the sensitive one, I'm the issue, I'm the problem, that can be one way that we get to maintain the attachment. That's if you're still in the relationship or trying to maintain the relationship in some way. If you're out of the relationship and you're still engaging in it, keep in mind, indoctrination is a tough thing to get rid of. Almost think of it as an accent, right? A person who has an accent from how they grew up learning a language, that's a hard thing to get rid of, if ever. People stay in the country for a longer time, right? If they've been in a different country for many, many years, they may slowly watch their accent slip away, especially when they go back to their native country and say, whoa, gosh, I have really lost, I'm not speaking this language in the same way. You'll see the difference. But it does stick around for a long time. And so in terms of managing it, it's the catching it, right? Because in a way, we could either call it a trauma response or a safety response. Back in the day, this is how you were quickly responding, right? At almost a nervous system level to be able to maintain an attachment. Well, that response, whether you call it a trauma response or a safety response, will persist even when you're outside of the relationship because your psyche is still trying to stay safe. Your sympathetic nervous system is still trying to keep you safe. So when you can think of it that way, I'm too sensitive, it is like, again, it's like a leftover. And if you can see that voice as something that was trying to protect you, but now it's harming you, you can receive it that way and say, oh, I see what this voice is trying to do. But it's, I don't mean to be farcical, but like, I kind of don't need you anymore, voice. Like, I am not too sensitive. It also helps a lot if you have people around you who are good people. It only takes one or two, or it could be a therapist. And because this is something I run into with folks all the time, is they'll say, I'm da 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 da, Dr. Ramani, I think I'm being too sensitive. And I'll be like, stop right there. You're having a feeling. How is that too sensitive? So then we'll dismantle that. So touching in with a person, someone you care about, right? That who gets you, who sees you. Even if you run it by them, say, am I being too sensitive about la la la? And a person will say, because my guess is you're not. That person will say, absolutely not. The way they behaved was absolutely atrocious. And it can be a game changer when you have someone to take it to who can give you a realistic look. Here's how I'm going to put it to you. That little voice of I'm too sensitive, I am not even going to take the bet that that will go away forever in your lifetime, but I'm hoping it can be quieter. It can be less present. And you might find that over time, it really only shows up at times you're quite vulnerable. And then there's things you can do. You can ground yourself. You can talk to yourself. You can say, I see what this voice is doing. You can talk to other voices and hear from them. I have to say my team is great at this. I'm like, am I being too, because we're going through this book promotion. It's been so difficult and a lot of things have gone wrong. And I will say to my team, I'm being too sensitive. And they've really been a godsend and saying, absolutely not, you're being too sensitive. That is not okay. Like what just happened was not okay. And I would very quickly feel like a sane person again, but my go-to was that. So it's be prepared for it, understand the function it serves, find those other voices and recognize like how it was trying to keep you safe. So I hope that's helpful. I'll try a few more questions. How can we let the narcissist know that we know who they are, that we see them? Oh, no, no, no. Remember, I mean, in fact, I don't know if my team is able to provide links to past videos in any of this, but there's a video we have, which is why you should never call the narcissistic person out. It's not worth it. Once we see it, once we know someone is narcissistic, we actually have taken back, I hate to say power in the relationship, but I'm going to say it. We take back a lot of the power in a relationship. And so, because now we get it, we kind of have the, like the code, like to break the code. So when they say things like, oh, I see what that is. Ooh, that's happening according to formula. Wow, this is really a thing. And strange as it is, it can leave us feeling a little less crazy. That's a tremendous return of power and wholeness into us. So you don't need to let them know, because if you tell them this, they're going to gaslight you. They're going to tell you you're the narcissist. They're going to scream at you. They're going to make your life sort of a living hell. Is that worth it? No. I think some people, they're like, I just want them to know at some point I see it. I don't recommend it if you're going to have to stay in this relationship. I really don't. Now, if you're on the way out and you don't have to have contact with them, for example, you're not co-parenting kids, you're not in a shared industry where reputational stuff can harm you. It's a narrow band of situations where you like really can tell someone on the way out, like, you narcissistic sack of you know what, you blah blah, you want to do that then, but there's no stakes, you do you. But in too many cases there's stakes. It's probably not worth it if you're going to have any ongoing contact with this person. No, you're letting them know, if you will, that you see it, because you're no longer engaging with them in the same way. You're just not. You're not taking the bait. You're not getting into it with them. You're not desperately trying to make them come back. You're not falling for all the same stuff, right? There's the power imbalance really goes away. Now, you have to be ready that the more you see it and the more you don't play their game, the more likely they might ultimately leave. Like, because they think that's their ultimate weapon. Like, I guess you're not that into it, or I'm not feeling connected to you. And if you don't care, becoming indifferent to them, that's the ultimate power. But telling them you see them, no. It'll come through in your actions because you're not engaging in the same way. And you really do become mildly indifferent to them. That sense of indifference towards them, that's probably the best show of this, that you get it. But not everyone's there. Just because you get it doesn't mean that the trauma bond has gone away. But I really can't say it enough. We had two videos. We had one, why you shouldn't call them out. And the second is, we had one that recently came out, like 4 things you should never say in a narcissistic relationship. One of them is to call them out. So I don't recommend it. And I know it's frustrating to hear that, because a lot of people say, I want them to know I see them. They kind of don't care. They really don't care about you. So you saying that, this is not going to make it's going to cause you more harm than good. You know it in you. And so you're not engaging with them in the same way. That's actually a very, very, very powerful feeling. Any other questions? Can a narcissistic people be insightful about other people, but not about themselves? So it really depends on what you're talking about with insight, right? Even for a psychologist, this is something that comes up even in our field, which is, we've been trained every which way to sit in a room with someone and kind of get what they're going through. It's a lot easier to get someone when you're not in their emotional stuff, right? We're able to kind of lift it's like looking at a view from high up. We're like a drone. We can lift up and we can look down. So I don't know how much of it's that we're being insightful about another person's situation, as well as we're able to be analytical about another person's situation. Insight, by definition, implies an awareness about ourselves, right? So they're being analytical, they're being smart or clever or something like that about another person. But narcissistic people, by definition, lack self-reflective capacity and they lack self-awareness. They just don't have it. So I would say that because many, and there's one thing to remember about narcissistic folks, and it throws us off. Narcissistic folks can be very, very socially perceptive. That's why they're successful, right? It's why they're great at sales. It's why they can be great at in some sort of leadership roles, because they're very perceptive. They can read the room. Why can they read the room so well? Because it matters in terms of getting supply, because the drive is so central. I have to get narcissistic supply, power, dominance, control, supply. That's a constant kind of call to action for them. Because of that, they are constantly very aware of what's happening around them, but in a very self-serving way, not in a sense of, oh, that person's suffering. I need, like many of you would do, like, oh my gosh, there's a sad person over there. Let me help them. They're sort of perceiving who's got the power in the room, sort of, is this sale going to go their way? Are people buying into their point of view? Are they getting all the attention? It's a very self-serving piece. So when they're able to provide sort of an analysis of someone else's situation, it's just that goes to intellect. And I'll be frank with you folks, there's more than a few mental health practitioners out there who are quite narcissistic. I know a few. So just because someone's becomes a therapist doesn't mean that they're not narcissistic. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're self-examined. And so keep that in mind too. So those people are incredibly aware and very analytical. But I'd say that probably the better word is, can they be very analytical and perceptive about someone else and not themselves? Absolutely. Because that goes, there are two different issues. One is actually very sort of internally nervous system, emotionally held. Like, can I be self-reflective and self-aware and aware of how I affect others? The other is, in a way, almost intrusive too. If somebody's not asking you to be analytical about them, but they can do it. And because of that, it's why they're often very, especially the grandiose narcissistic folks, can be very, very socially skilled in that way. Probably much, much less so the vulnerable narcissistic folks. The malignant narcissistic folks, no. The malignant narcissistic folks are actually really good at smelling out a weakness so they can corner someone, right? They're really good at, it's the word I'm looking for. They're it almost like just sort of figuring out, it's almost like a person who's casing the joint, right? Figuring out where the weak windows are to enter a place, to burglarize it. They're good at that with people. They're able to figure out exactly the pressure points in a person so that as they get closer to them, they know exactly how they can sort of lock them down or make them scared. So it's much more terrible what that perceptiveness is, but it's more like a way a criminal would think, like a person who's going to break the law, whereas a grandiose narcissist can actually be quite socially perceptive. Other questions? Give it a few more. If you have a narcissistic therapist, how does that manifest in therapy sessions? It can manifest in a few ways. One is you might feel judged. You might feel shamed. They may talk about themselves too much. They not only may not hear you or feel attuned to you, they'll really push their point of view, like, no, that's not right, right? And not in a playful way, like really like, you're wrong, I'm right kind of thing. And therapy should be a place of subjectivity. What you're feeling is valid. Nobody gets to tell you. And they might tell you that's not a valid feeling or that's ridiculous. You might feel insulted. You might feel devalued. You might be made to feel dumb. Nobody should ever feel dumb in therapy. You're the expert of you. You have someone who's kind of taking you on a tour of you and kind of helping you see themes and connections, but you're the expert of you. You may not feel psychologically safe. You may feel like, ooh, if I share this, I just don't trust this person if I say this. All of those things would be, all of those things could be ways that could manifest in a therapy session. They also may not take the therapeutic frame seriously. They may chronically show up like 15 minutes late, or change a schedule on you very quickly and not make allowances for that, or not apologize for that, or not have empathy for how that's affecting you. And stuff happens. Sometimes therapists have to switch schedules, but they'll do it in a very sort of almost dismissive sort of a way. They can feel quite cold and feel quite remote. Now, some people will say, well, that's not fair. Maybe that's the model of therapy they work in. I don't buy that. I think if you are actually going to receive someone's vulnerability in a room and you can't be warm with that, I don't get that. And that feels I don't know. I can't get down that. What are they narcissistic? I don't know. But those are the patterns you might see if you had a narcissistic therapist. Any other questions? It is very difficult to explain narcissistic abuse to friends and family who haven't experienced such abuse themselves. Any tips? My gosh, isn't it? Thank you for sharing this. I mean, this is part of why I wrote the book. My hope is that it actually gets in the hands of people who may not have experienced it. You brought up a huge issue, which is, and I'll tell you how, it's very personal, this question to me, because I've talked to so many different people in the last few months promoting this, right? And I've always been struck when I've gone onto a show, like a podcast or something like that, and the person clearly doesn't get this. And they've become very intellectual about it, right? And they're almost trying to like poke holes in the theory, to which kind of saddens me, because I think this is people's real pain, and you're turning this into like a little bit of a chess game. I can shut that stuff down like this, but it bothers me because what it tells me is that there's people who are going through this in a very real way, who are having to mount up the same kinds of arguments, but it feels very different when it's acutely happening to you. I would say a couple things off the bat. Number one, don't call it narcissistic abuse. That term throws people, because you've got to remember, just think about what we were talking about today. The vast majority of people think of narcissism as a person who loves themselves and has a big ego. So that doesn't even make sense to them. What are you talking about? Like their big ego is bothering you? And so because that's the assumption, it's a bad word. Don't use the terminology with people who don't get it. So that's number one. I would say that number two, you shouldn't have to explain yourself to anyone, but if you are in a context where people are trying to understand maybe why there's a relational difficulty or why you might be struggling, for example, sadly, sometimes people do better with examples, right? So instead of saying they're narcissistic or narcissistic abuse, you can say, well, these are some of the patterns that are happening in my relationship. And as a result, I don't feel, and use terms like, I don't feel psychologically safe in this relationship. I feel like if I'm vulnerable, I'm going to get judged and shamed. Like, talk about how you're feeling and connect it with things that this person is doing. Like I said, you don't know anyone on the damn planet an explanation. But if you are having conversations, using that languaging can help. Don't even use the word gaslighted, because even that puts people on their back foot. So really link it to, this is happening. It's happening repeatedly. It's leaving me feeling this way. I don't feel I could be myself. I don't even feel like I can show up as my whole self. I really feel like I've backslid a lot as a result of this relationship. I don't trust this person. Using that kind of language and talking about the consistency, and then throwing in there the piece that what's so messed up about this is that a lot of the world thinks that this is actually kind of a cool person, and I'm seeing a very different version of them behind closed doors. When you share the narrative in that way, you're giving a person a fuller picture than using a term like narcissistic abuse, which is going to confuse them from the jump and make them doubt you. Take that away, but also keep in mind, just I really want you to keep holding that, is that you don't owe anyone an explanation for your pain. But if you are choosing to talk to them about it, spoon feeding it to them a little if it's never happened to them, because aren't they lucky that it hasn't, frankly. But in those little digestible bites. But I'll be frank with you, if you keep running into this in someone and they continue to doubt you, they're not a safe person for you either. Discernment isn't just about disengaging from the narcissistic person. It's also recognizing that when you are being vulnerable and sharing pain with someone and they're turning it into a exam question, you might be able to maintain some kind of relationship with them, but maybe not one that has that kind of emotional depth to it. So I hope that's all been helpful. I'm actually going to be jumping, actually, to give a lecture on narcissistic abuse today. So you've all gotten me very much in the headspace and reminded me how important this is, and I want to make sure I take some time to prepare it a little bit more. Again, I want to say a couple things. Like I said, sales will close tonight at midnight, and then we'll see what happens. Whatever happens, I will never be able to thank this community enough for supporting this issue. And your questions remind me, this last one in particular really reminds me of how you, by getting this book into the public consciousness in a very specific way, who knows, maybe someone like this person who just asked this last question, someone might pick up this book and say, oh, that's what she's talking about. That's what they're talking about. So this was you. Right. And I do appreciate that. Yes, I wrote it and promoted blah, blah, blah. But it took a community of people to say, I really don't want this to be a thing anymore. Like I want to feel like a whole sane human being once again, and taking this onto yourselves has been nothing but courageous. So I can't thank you enough for supporting it, for getting behind it. And again, for those of you who want to get it, hard copy, ebook, and you still want to get some of the goodies, you're new to this and you want to like, hey, I want to go to that virtual retreat, you can still do it up to midnight in your time zone. You can get raffle entries. You're like, hey, I want to try a few more raffle entries. Go for it. Buy more books. You can. That's your prerogative. Tell people about it. Share about it. And again, I will never be able to thank you enough for your support. And I'll give you a break for a couple of days. And I'll be on airplanes for much of tomorrow. So I will then, we'll do another live though next week. I've a slightly lighter week. I'm actually get to sit in a normal, not on airplanes week next week, which I'm really happy about. So we'll definitely be doing some lives, and it always is helpful if you even want to throw some out here. I have some of your suggestions I haven't gotten to, but if you could throw some suggestions right now, what you'd like to see some of these lives be about, I would love it, because this really does guide me in what I do. So go throw me those suggestions. Order the book if you've already ordered it. Please enjoy it as you read it, review it, talk about it. Start book clubs, keep coming back, send us ideas for what you want to hear about. I'm going to write your ideas down. Go ahead, send them. If you have ideas of what you want lives to be about, we've already done some of these. And then otherwise, I will see you at our next live at some point. Let's see what magic we can make happen today and push this book until midnight tonight. And listen, in a world of people, most folks who write these kinds of books, they've got armies behind us and behind them. Consider yourselves my army, but it's a different game. And like I said, we finally showed that David and Goliath, we put up one hell of a fight. So please, 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 if you have any ideas we want for lives, drop them in. And if you don't, that's fine. My team will pick them up from the chat. And otherwise, I will see you. Okay, rumination, great, thank you. It's okay, I'll get that down. Siblings, awesome. That's a really good idea. Coercive control, you got it. Very important point. Siblings times 2. We're definitely going to do that now. Thank you. Thank you for that. That's actually, that siblings idea is so powerful. I have some really, really important insights to share there, because I've worked with a lot of folks clinically on sibling relationships. Yeah. Mental health professionals who don't get it. Any others? Yes, friendships. Very similar to, yes, friendships. How are they? Yeah, the origin story. Mental health professionals. Money and power. I could use a little of both right now, but not in the narcissistic way. In fact, somebody said to me the other day, they said people are dominated by one of 3 things: power, money, or fame. And which one is a narcissistic person motivated by? And that was a hard question for me to answer, because I would say all 3. But I said, if somebody really forced me into one, I'd be curious to have you drop in the chat which you think it would be: power, money, or fame. Because again, they're very correlated, right? And mine would have been power, because I think power then is sort of like, it's the one ring that rules them all, right? It kind of brings all that other stuff in. But it's money and power are really complicated. And we're going to talk about that. That's a great one, because it's such a classical part of what motivates narcissistic folks. Anyhow, I want to say thank you again. Thanks for sharing part of your Saturday with me. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Wish me luck on this lecture. I still get nervous when I go in front of groups. I'm going to be very honest with you. So I kind of lock myself in here and I rehearse and I practice. So I do get nervous. So send me some good vibes. And then you'll hear from me next week, and YouTube and all the usual things will be happening, and the healing community and all the things we do. So I'll be back. I promise you that. So take good care. Have a beautiful day. And thank you for being a part of mine.